so this is 914 in biology, and we're just going back and reviewing sort of steps in the scientific methods. And of course we know that the first step is just making observations, which are just factual, just simply information from your senses, and then to question those observations. And once we have questions, we know what kind of data to gather. And once we gather that data, we have to organize it. So what we're looking at right now is a chart that shows the months of the year on an axis: January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. I have December on this one. Okay, so let's look at some data. Okay, so at this point we've got some raw data. We've gotten it organized in some way, but that's just data. If we're going to go anywhere beyond that, we have to draw some conclusions from the data. So saying we saw 8 albino deer in the month of June. Okay, that's factual. But to move on from there, we have to draw a conclusion. That's called inferring. So when we go beyond just the straight up facts to drawing a conclusion about those facts, that is an inference. I'm going to write that down. Oops. An inference is when we draw a conclusion based on our data. Okay? That's when we go beyond just the data. So what could we infer from this? There's more than one thing, by the way, that we could infer. There are several things we could infer. Give me one thing that this data could lead you to believe. That they were there all along, but they're really well camouflaged in the winter months? Is that something you could infer? Yeah. Could it be true? Maybe. What else could you infer from this? Okay. That they're just visible now. That, like we said, they've been there all along. They were so well camouflaged in the winter, our spotters weren't catching sight of them, and now they are. What other things could we infer? We could suggest, we could infer that maybe our spotters weren't spending as much time outside when it was cold. Maybe we've got more spotters in the woods now. We're getting more data. So we would have to look at the number of spotters and the number of hours that they spent to see if that was true. Let's say that we had the same number of spotters spending the same number of hours straight through. What else could we infer? There are a number of things we could infer. You can make inferences from data. You can make lots of different inferences from the same data. You can draw a lot of different conclusions from looking at the same data set. Could we infer that maybe a bunch of deer suddenly turned albino? Well, we could. I mean, it's a conclusion we could draw. It doesn't sound plausible. It doesn't sound possible. Yeah, it would, wouldn't it? They shed their winter coats, and when their summer growth came in, they were albino. Presto. Yeah, it's not likely. Scientifically, it doesn't match up with what we know. It's not consistent with what we know about coat color in deer. So, I mean, you could draw that inference, but pretty quickly, again, looking at other data, what do we know about albino deer in general, you can throw it out. You know, we can draw the inference that we didn't have as many spotters out in the winter. But looking at the data about your spotters then, you can throw that out. I'll tell you what my hypothesis is here, or what the inference that I'm drawing from this data. My hypothesis, and remember, what's a hypothesis? Yeah. It's how you think it works. It's a working explanation. It's the first explanation you come to after you've gotten a bunch of data. So it is your first explanation, You know what is true of hypotheses? They tend to change. The first explanation you come up with for something is very often not the last. Okay? So it's a first explanation. It's a working explanation. I believe that is already on the board. Yeah. And it's probably going to change. That is probably going to change. Okay, now, my hypothesis about this, and very often hypotheses start off with something like, I believe, or it is suspected that. So I suspect that we had an albino buck who has recently become dominant. So within a group of deer, within an area, what is true of the dominant buck? What do you know about deer? He gets to mate with everybody. Or if not everybody, a lot of somebodies. The dominant buck mates with a lot of does. So my suspicion, I suspect, that we had a young albino buck who's been sighted. Maybe we had more than one young albino buck. I mean, this is only data from part of 1 year. We don't have data from years behind this. I suspect that this young albino buck has recently become dominant and has mated a lot of does. And I suspect that's what we're seeing. That's my suspicion. That's my hypothesis. So, what now? In order to test that hypothesis, we have to first make a prediction. Okay, so we have prediction. And pre, as has been pointed out, means before. No leaning. Thanks. What does D-I-C-T refer to? Dict. Have you seen that as a part of speech before? So let me give you some other words that have that. Diction. Dictionary. What does it relate to? What do you think? Dictate is another one of those words, but it doesn't tell us what it refers to. You're right. Dictate, diction, dictionary all go in this same, they have that same root. What do you think, James? No? What is dictation? Somebody else can raise their hand for this one. What is dictation? To take dictation or to give dictation. What does that mean? To dictate something. What does that mean? Everybody's sitting down. Olivia.
To tell them what to do.
To speak things to someone. To dictate. I could dictate a letter to you. You can have a seat. So yeah, you can dictate a letter to someone. That means I'm going to speak aloud what I want the letter to say, and you're going to write it down. To dictate can also mean to tell someone what to do, like a dictator in charge of a country. Okay, so we're starting to hone in on what that D-I-C-T, dict, refers to. Think dictionary. Think dictation. What do those things have in common? What is good diction? Oh, you have lovely diction. It means how you speak. So it means you pronounce words appropriately. Hey, no touching the lab tables. They're chem lab tables. You have no idea what's been on them. If you have good diction, you pronounce words well. You speak clearly. My goodness, you have lovely diction. So, diction, dictation, dictionary.
The meaning of a word?
It has to do with speaking or words. Yeah. Okay, you can have a seat. Oops. Not very good English, is it?
No.
If you before speak, what does that mean?
Speak before you speak.
Okay, I'll let you sit down on that one. Okay. If you before speak, what if you predict the weather? What does that mean? Ooh, this is good. Raise your hand. If you predict the weather, want to take it, Morgan? No? Okay. Now you're already sitting. If you predict the weather, how many of you have looked up a weather prediction for the weekend? What does it mean, Jonna? Well, what does it mean? Morgan? Well, they're telling you before it happens, so you can have a seat. Yeah, a weather prediction is some weather person somewhere's prediction of what's going to happen, meaning before the weather occurs, so on Thursday, they are telling you what's going to happen on Saturday. That is a prediction. Okay? It's literally before speak. Okay, you can all sit down now. Thanks for playing. Stand up, sit down, bingo. So a prediction in the terms that we're talking about, in terms of science, usually takes the form of if something, then blank. So let me give you an example related to my hypothesis about the deer. If my hypothesis is correct, and we have one albino buck who is suddenly fathering a bunch of offspring, if we take blood samples from all of those albino deer that we're seeing, they should share more DNA than other deer in the area. Does that make sense? Have you seen Maury Povich's Who's Your Daddy shows? Okay. Well, we're playing Who's Your Daddy with the deer. So we can't actually pin it down to a buck because we're not going to get a bunch of bucks to come in and give a blood sample. And we're going to match buck A, buck B, buck C. Nah. It's just going to be down to how much DNA they share. So how many of you have a sibling who goes to school here? K through 12, anywhere. Okay. How many of you have a half-sibling who goes to school here? Okay. How many of you have a cousin who goes to school here? Okay. If we take a blood sample from everybody K through 12 here, we can pretty quickly group students and say, oh, look, these three share, on average, 50% of their DNA. They must be siblings. Oh, look, these four share 25% of their DNA, 25, 30% of their DNA. They're probably half-siblings. They probably share one parent. Oh, these share about 15% of their DNA. They're probably first cousins. And you can go on down until you can say, oh, you know, these two share more than we would expect in two completely unrelated strangers, but not so much that we think they're close relations. They might be fourth or fifth cousins. Okay? So we can look at how much DNA two individuals share, and we can do that with our deer. So this means we are going to have to get out, you know, dart guns. We're going to have to sedate a bunch of deer. We're going to have to take blood samples. We'll probably have to take blood samples from a lot of deer, including ones that aren't albinos. Maybe all the deer in that area are closely related. So we want to make sure that we have a control group of non-albino deer. So my prediction would look something like this. So we're going to say that if that's true, then this is what we should see. So we have to make some kind of prediction before we do the next thing. The next thing is actually testing our hypothesis. We test our hypothesis by doing what? How do we test things in science? Well, with sometimes an experiment. In biology, very often in lieu of just an experiment, we do what's called a study. And an experiment or a study is a way to test a hypothesis. So we go out. Our study involves, and we're going to design a study, our study involves tracking, sedating, and drawing blood from every albino deer that's been spotted in the last 5 months. Running their blood back to a lab and getting DNA results. Okay, so the experiment or the study tests the hypothesis. Now, What if it comes back and it shows that some of these deer share almost no DNA? What happens to my hypothesis?
Changes.
It changes. Yeah. What if it shows that about half of them share enough DNA that we believe about half of them share a parent, but the other half share DNA with one another, but not with that half? What happens to my hypothesis? It changes. Okay? So your results can come back and either support or not support your hypothesis. If it comes back and it looks like we really have two groups of half-siblings, we have one group that shares about enough DNA to share a parent, and maybe we have another group that shares enough DNA to share a parent, I start to think that maybe there's something else going on. Maybe this isn't the same buck. Maybe we have two albino bucks. What do we need to do? Get more data. We need to get more data. It might be blood tests. It might be actual tracking collars this time. It might be tracking darts. They can put a little microchip in a dog. You can do the same thing to a deer. Dart it, sedate it, insert a tracking chip. We can see if there's more than one buck. That way, if our spotters have something that allows them to get a signal on these guys, we can tell if we're seeing the same buck over and over, or if there are in fact two dominant albino bucks. But we keep gathering data. So all through this process, we gathered data here, we made a hypothesis, but then we're still gathering data as we're making our prediction. And to test our prediction, we're gathering more data. You continue to collect data. It's a constant process. Okay. Questions? Comments? Okay, so before class, yes.
I'll just take a second.
Yes, if you have a study hall, that's great. Before you walk in tomorrow, you're going to take the quiz that is linked to today's date.